Hello guys, DarkLord Project here again, and today we have a $400 fast gaming PC build. So before we get started, I'd like to mention that I actually did build this build for a client of mine. He had a $750 budget, but the actual tower was $400. Everything else went towards peripherals, Windows 8.1, monitor, etc. Now before we get started with the actual build, I'd like to mention the benchmarks for this PC so you know what to expect for this $400 fast gaming PC build. Now currently on YouTube, this is one of the fastest $400 PCs they could possibly get. When I built this, there was no issues at all, and it ran TF2 at 180 frames per second at ultra settings, Tomb Raider at 60 frames per second to normal to high settings, and Payday 2 at high settings while being recorded at 60 frames per second. Now those benchmarks sound like from a PC that's around $600. I myself was also pretty surprised by these benchmarks. These are some pretty amazing benchmarks. I would easily expect these from a $600 to $500 PC, but we did achieve these with this $400 PC build. Now that we got the benchmarks out of the way, let's get started with the build. So the CPU for this build is an Intel Pentium G3258, which is $64. It's a dual core CPU, it's clocked at 3.2 GHz, and it's Devil's Canyon. So this is a fairly new CPU, came about I think 5 months ago, 6 months ago, but don't hold me to it. It is a dual core CPU, it doesn't have hyper-threading, so it's only dual core, it's not like 4 cores, it doesn't double just like the i7. It also is 3.2 GHz, but this can easily be overclocked. With the stock cooler, you could easily achieve 4 GHz, and if you don't feel safe using the stock cooler, you could easily get the Hyper 212 Evo for a really good price. I would assume around $40 to $30, but the prices do fluctuate a lot for the CPU cooler. It is Devil's Canyon, so like I said, feel free to overclock this thing. Devil's Canyon's goal is to really overclock CPUs a lot and get a lot of performance out of it. For a $64 CPU, there's really not to complain with it because you are getting so much performance for a really cheap price. Now the motherboard for this build is the Asus H81MK, which is $56. It's a micro ATX, it's made by a good manufacturer, and it's designed for overclocking. Now because we do have a Devil's Canyon CPU, I made sure I picked out a very good motherboard that can easily support overclocking. Now Asus does have this auto overclock, which is perfectly fine when you do have a stock cooler. It does overclock it to the fan and everything, so there really shouldn't be any overheating, and Asus does a pretty good job with this. It also is made by a good manufacturer. In my opinion, Asus and sometimes Gigabyte make some of the highest quality motherboards out there. Asus is totally #1 on my list. They make some of the best motherboards like the Asus X99. Their H series for the Intel Pentium G3258 is absolutely amazing, and there's just a lot of great products for them, so I totally recommend buying this motherboard. It's also micro ATX, which is pretty standard for more of these cheaper builds. ATX does have some better expandability, but micro ATX will be perfectly fine for this build. The RAM for this build is the G-Skills Ripjaw series, which is $76. It's 8 GB, two 4 GB sticks, it has a small profile, and it's DDR3 clocked at 1600 MHz. 8 GB, two 4 GB sticks at $76 is pretty decent for most of my budget builds. Usually an 8 GB set for 4 GB is usually around $80, so you're saving yourself $4 because every dollar does count for a $400 build. It's also DDR3 with 600 MHz. This is perfectly fine. 1600 MHz is standard for most DDR3 RAM, and you don't need that extra speed for your RAM because this isn't an APU build. This does have a dedicated GPU. It also does have a smaller profile. If you do decide to get a bigger CPU cooler in the future, the RAM shouldn't really get in the way because when it comes to micro ATX builds, RAM can easily get in the way of the CPU cooler. I myself have the Hyper 212 Evo and some small size RAM. It isn't the G-Skill Ripjaw series, but it is a little bit shorter. It really gets really close to the CPU cooler, so a small profile RAM can be beneficial in the future. The storage for this build is the Seagate Barracuda, which is $56. It's a 3.5-inch HDD, it's 7,200 RPM, and it's 1 TB. So I use this storage a lot in my build. It's a really great hard drive. You know, it's 3.5-inch HDD, 7,200 RPM, and 1 TB, which is standard for most hard drives. It is only $56. It's a little cheaper than the Western Digital Caviar Blue, and I really do like Seagate as a company. Western Digital, you know, they're perfectly fine, so it's preference for this. If you really do want to get the Western Digital Caviar Blue, it should be perfectly fine if you get that too. There shouldn't be any compatibility issues. The graphics card for this build is the XFX Radeon R7 260X Core Edition, which is $130. It has 2 GB of GDDR5 RAM. It's the Core Edition, which means it's above average speed. It's clocked at 1.07 GHz and it uses 115 watts. So the Core Edition by XFX is what I highly recommend when it comes to more outdated cards. Not exactly outdated, but older cards. They really revamp them and make some changes that need to be made. And it does keep the price really low. $130 for a graphics card this fast is amazing what you're paying for. 2 GB of GDDR5 should be perfectly fine for one monitor use when it comes to gaming. It is 1.07 GHz, which is above average because this is the Core Edition of the R7 260X, and it does use only 115 watts. You know, it doesn't use as much wattage as the R9 series, which is nice so we could get a cheaper power supply. Like I said, the XFX Radeon R7 260X can easily crank games out at really high settings while keeping only a $130 price tag. The case for this build is the NZXT Source 210, which is $30. It's an ATX mid-tower case. It has good airflow, it holds the parts perfectly, and it has decent cable management. I've been recommending this case a lot on Pure PC because it does have some amazing qualities to it while keeping a $30 price tag. The NZXT Source 210 fits most builds, small or large. It could easily fit it. The ATX mid-tower case is perfectly standard for most of my builds, and it does have really good airflow, which is great to keep the PC really cool. Most of my PCs are built in this case and they don't produce a lot of heat, and the fans don't usually rev up that fast because it does have some really great airflow. It does hold the parts perfectly fine and didn't have any compatibility issues with this case. Everything worked perfectly fine when I installed it, and I was actually quite surprised how smooth the build went. It does have decent cable management. It only has, I think, around 3 to 4 holes around it. You know, it does work here and there, but you could just shove all the cords underneath the hard drive bay and they are hidden from most angles. Or if you really want to, you could get the version of this case without the window and save yourself about $5. It really depends on the rebate. It might be $5 to $10, but if you really don't care about cable management, this case is perfectly fine too. The power supply for this build is the Corsair CX430, which is $25. It's 430 watts, it's 80 plus bronze certified, and it only supports Molex for fans. Now this CX430 is $25, it does have a $20 rebate, and when it comes to Corsair, they kind of are a pain in the butt when it comes to rebates. 430 watts should be more than enough to power up this build. The Pentium G3258 doesn't really use a lot of power even when it's overclocked, and like I said, the XFX Radeon R7 260X Core Edition only uses around 115 watts. Another nice thing about this value PSU, it is 80 plus bronze certified. You know, when it does have 80 plus bronze certified, that first shows that's most likely a higher quality hard drive compared to other ones that don't have it, and it will save you some money when it comes to the power bill. Now the only issue with this PC build was this power supply. If you do decide to upgrade to the CX500, which is around $10 extra currently, you won't have this issue. But the big issue is if you do decide to install more chassis fans in the future, you will have to get Molex adapters or use Molex fans. Now the chassis fan plug-in port on the motherboard will work fine for the only fan included in the NZXT Source 210, but like I said, in the future you will have to get adapters because the power supply only has Molex for fans. That's pretty much it, guys. Make sure you check out purepc.net, like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you later.